The date is November 14th. The time is exactly 4:17 a.m. We are in the desolate, freezing expanse of the Denmark Strait. This is the jagged scar of ocean that separates the volcanic peaks of Iceland from the frozen, lifeless coast of Greenland. It is a place where the world ends and begins. The water temperature is barely 33 degrees Fahrenheit. The air is a crushing -30, a cold so absolute it freezes the salt spray onto the railings of ships before it can even hit the deck. For 80 years, this stretch of water, the GIUK Gap, has been the most paranoid patch of ocean on Earth. It is the fatal funnel. It is the only doorway through which the Russian Northern Fleet can escape their ice-locked bastions in Murmansk and threaten the commercial lifelines of the Atlantic. During the Cold War, this water was wired for sound. Every whale breach, every shifting tectonic plate, every propeller turn was listened to by the SOSUS line, the sound surveillance system, a chain of hydrophones resting in the crushing dark of the abyss. On this morning, the men and women at the NATO Maritime Command in Northwood, England, were battling the fatigue of the graveyard shift. The screens in the bunker were awash in the green static of routine biological noise, a pod of humpbacks near the Faroe Islands, a seismic tremor near the mid-Atlantic ridge. Nothing tactical, nothing dangerous. Or so they thought. At 4:17 a.m. in 12 seconds, the seafloor sensors detected an anomaly. It wasn't a noise, it was a pressure wave. It was a displacement of water so massive that the automated algorithms initially categorized it as a geological event, an underwater landslide. But landslides don't have a rhythmic mechanical heartbeat. Senior sonar analyst David Thorne was the first to see it. The waterfall display on his console, usually a calm cascade of random noise, suddenly tore open. A thick, jagged black line cut through the frequencies. Then another, then four more. These were not biological. These were twin-screw cavitation patterns. Heavy screws, military screws. Thorne didn't breathe. He adjusted the gain. The signature was muffled, distorted by what looked like an active noise cancellation field, a cone of silence. Technology that intelligence had only theorized about but never seen. But physics is physics. You cannot move a 25,000-ton displacement hull through water without leaving a scar. Contact, Thorne whispered, his voice cracking in the sterile silence of the bunker. Multiple contacts, deep, fast, and massive. At 4:18 a.m., the National Reconnaissance Office in Virginia received the flash alert. They retasked a KH-11 keyhole satellite, drifting over the Arctic Circle, to punch through the heavy cloud cover using synthetic aperture radar. The image that returned was grainy, ghost-like, but undeniable. Emerging from the blinding snowstorm, running dark, running silent, was a nightmare made of steel. It was the largest joint naval task force ever assembled by the Eastern powers. And it wasn't just sailing, it was sprinting. Leading the formation, like a spear tip, was the Pyotr Veliki, Peter the Great. She is a Kirov-class battlecruiser, a relic of the Soviet need to destroy aircraft carriers. She's the size of a World War II battleship, nuclear-powered, and refitted with the terrifying 3 NM-22 Zircon hypersonic missiles. These weapons don't just fly, they scream at Mach 9. They are too fast for traditional radar to track, too unpredictable for traditional interceptors to kill. But the Pyotr Veliki was not alone. Flanking her starboard side was the Nanchang, a Type 055 Renhai-class destroyer from the Chinese People's Liberation Army Navy. Western naval architects don't just respect this ship, they fear it. It bristles with 112 vertical launch cells, capable of firing everything from anti-ship cruise missiles to orbital anti-satellite weapons. It is a floating fortress, designed to create an anti-access area denial bubble, a no-fly, no-sail zone hundreds of miles wide. And there was more. Trailing in their wake was a ghost fleet, frigates, oilers, and intelligence trawlers. But the real horror was what the thermal sensors picked up trailing the surface ships. 4 massive plumes of slightly warmer water rising to the surface. Reactor coolant. 4 Beret-class nuclear ballistic missile submarines. Boomers. Each one carries 16 Bulava ballistic missiles. Each missile carries 6 to 10 nuclear warheads. Do the math. That is nearly 400 city killers running silent just off the coast of Greenland. This was Operation Northern Spear. It was a masterstroke of logistical deception. They had used the cover of a massive blizzard and a coordinated cyber attack on Norwegian radar stations to slip through the gaps undetected. They were now in the deep Atlantic. Their position gave them a straight, unblockable shot at Washington, D.C., New York, and the strategic command bunkers in Omaha. The flight time for a hypersonic missile from this range? Less than 15 minutes. For the analysts staring at their screens in the Pentagon, the blood drained from their faces. This wasn't just a deployment. This was a gun held to the Temple of the West. The question wasn't how they got there anymore. The question was, why? At 4:22 a.m., the answer came. It didn't come via a hotline or a diplomatic cable. It came as a scream of electromagnetic energy. The Nanchang activated its Type 346b Dragon Eye radar. It didn't sweep. It pulsed. A massive, focused beam of energy that lit up the electronic spectrum for 1,000 miles. They were painting every commercial airliner, every weather satellite, and every military receiver in the hemisphere. It was a challenge, a declaration of dominance. They were effectively saying, "We are here. The Atlantic is no longer your lake. We have checkmated you." The audacity was paralyzing. If the U.S. fired on them, they started World War III. If they did nothing, the U.S. admitted that it could no longer defend its own shores. The Eastern Alliance had calculated this perfectly. They relied on the hesitation of democracy. They relied on the fear of escalation. But they had made one fatal miscalculation. They assumed the United States Navy had been sleeping. They assumed that because the U.S. fleet was quiet, it was absent. They were wrong. The clock was ticking. The fleet had revealed itself at 4:17 a.m. By 4:58 a.m., 41 minutes later, the geography of the world would be rewritten. At 4:25 a.m., 3 minutes after the fleet lit up their radar, the atmosphere inside the White House Situation Room was suffocating. The air conditioning hummed, a low drone beneath the frantic voices of aides and the click of secure line receivers. The president sat at the head of the mahogany table looking at the large screen displaying the tactical map of the North Atlantic. Red icons swarmed the Greenland coast. Blue icons, friendly forces, seemed dangerously sparse. The chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Marcus Vance, leaned forward. His voice was gravel, steady, devoid of panic. "Mr. President, this is a distinct alteration of the strategic balance. If those Beret submarines establish a patrol box in the mid-Atlantic, our missile defense window shrinks from 30 minutes to 10. We cannot allow them to dig in." "What are the options?" the president asked. "Diplomacy?" "They just lit us up with fire control radar, sir," the national security advisor interjected. "That is an act of war in any other century. They aren't looking to talk. They're looking to dictate terms." "We have a contingency," General Vance said. "Operation Silent Anvil." The room went quiet. Silent Anvil was a black book plan. It was the break glass in case of emergency response to a total failure of the GIUK blockade. It relied on assets that were barely out of the prototype phase. "Execute," the president said. At 4:30 a.m., the orders went out. Not via satellite, which could be jammed, but via LF, extremely low frequency, radio waves, transmitted through the bedrock of the Earth itself to receivers deep underwater. 300 miles south of the Russian fleet, drifting in the crushing pressure of the deep Atlantic scattering layer, was a ghost, the USS Jimmy Carter. She is the last of the Seawolf class, but she is unique. She is longer, heavier, and darker than her sisters. She was built for multi-mission platform operations, a polite Navy term for spycraft, wiretapping, and wet work. She doesn't exist on public rosters. Her crew doesn't talk. Inside the Jimmy Carter, the lighting was rigged for red. Commander James Sterling looked at the printed message handed to him by the radio man. He didn't blink. He turned to his executive officer. "Battle stations," Sterling said softly. "Spin up the orcas, all of them." "All of them, sir?" the XO asked. "All of them. We aren't just sinking them, XO. We're raising them." And simultaneously, at Keflavik Air Base in Iceland, the wind was howling at 60 knots. The hangars, usually dormant, were hives of frantic activity. But it wasn't the roar of jet engines filling the air. Not yet. 4 dark shapes were being towed onto the runway. They looked like slices of obsidian, alien and geometric. These were the B-21 Raiders. The Raider is the 6th-generation stealth bomber. It is designed to be invisible. Not just to radar, but to thermal imaging, to acoustic sensors, to the naked eye at night. It is a hole in the sky. These 4 aircraft had been rotated into Iceland under the cover of the previous night's darkness, hidden in reinforced bunkers, waiting for exactly this moment. The pilots strapped in. There was no chatter. The mission profile was uploaded directly to their helmet-mounted displays. They weren't carrying nukes. They were carrying something much smarter. The plan was a synchronized multi-domain strike designed to overwhelm the enemy's decision-making loop. The OODA loop: observe, orient, decide, act. In modern warfare, speed is the only currency that matters. If you can act faster than your enemy can process the information, you win. The U.S. strategy was to blind them, deafen them, and then shatter them before they could even reach for the red button. By 4:35 a.m., the trap was set. On the bridge of the Pyotr Veliki, the mood was triumphant. Admiral Volkov watched the radar scopes. They were clear. No incoming missiles, no fighter jets. Just the empty ocean and the terrified silence of the Western world. He turned to his Chinese counterpart, Captain Lee. "They are stunned," Volkov laughed, lighting a cigarette, a breach of protocol that he felt he had earned. "The Americans have forgotten how to fight. They are waiting for a committee meeting." Captain Lee nodded, but his eyes were narrowed. He was looking at the sonar display. The ocean Lee said quietly. It is too quiet. Even the biologicals have stopped. Lee was right. The whales, the shrimp, the background hum of the sea, it had all vanished. They didn't realize that the water around them was already alive with machines. The USS Jimmy Carter had opened its massive hangar bay, the wasp waste section of the sub. It hadn't fired torpedoes. It had released a swarm. 12 Orca XL UOVs, extra large. Unmanned undersea vehicles were gliding through the dark. These were not small drones. Each was the size of a subway car. They were autonomous, AI-driven, and silent. They communicated with each other via short-burst laser links that couldn't be intercepted. They were positioning themselves directly beneath the keels of the Russian and Chinese ships, matching their speed, hiding in the acoustic shadow of the enemy's own engine noise. At 4:40 a.m., the B-21 Raiders reached their release altitude of 50,000 feet. The bomb bay doors snapped open. The Orcas were in position. The satellites were aligned. The enemy fleet was sailing into a kill box, a three-dimensional cage of American firepower constructed in minutes. Admiral Volkov was still smiling, looking at the horizon, waiting for a surrender that would never come. He had 7 minutes to live. 4:42 a.m. The engagement begins. It starts not with fire, but with darkness. The signal was given. The Orca drones, hovering 50 feet below the hulls of the Pyotr Veliky and the Nanchang, detonated their payloads. These weren't high explosives. They were HPM generators, high-power microwave pulses. Underwater, the effect was catastrophic. The pulse traveled through the water, coupling with the steel hulls of the ships, turning the vessels themselves into giant antennas. The energy surged into the ship's grounding systems, bypassing the surge protectors, frying the delicate silicon wafers of the radar computers, the comms arrays, and the fire control systems. On the bridge of the Pyotr Veliky, the world ended in a shower of sparks. Every screen went black. The lights died. The hum of the ventilation system cut out. The smell of ozone and burnt plastic filled the air. "Report!" Volkov screamed, grabbing a handheld radio. Dead static. He looked out the window. The Nanchang was drifting, its massive phased array radar panels dark. They were blind. The most advanced fleet in the world had just been lobotomized. Confusion reigned. The captain shouted orders to switch to mechanical backups, to manual steering, to optical targeting. But you cannot fight a hypersonic war with binoculars and a compass. The joint fleet was now a collection of isolated deaf steel islands drifting in the dark. 4:45 a.m. The sky opens up. The B-21 Raiders released their payload. 48 LRASMs, long-range anti-ship missiles. These missiles are hideous in their intelligence. As they dropped from the stratosphere, they deployed wings and engines. But they didn't just fly straight. They began to talk to each other. The swarm algorithm designated targets. Missiles 1 through 6, take the carrier. Missiles 7 through 12, suppress the destroyers. They dropped to sea-skimming height, flying 10 feet above the waves, hidden behind the curvature of the Earth. They didn't use radar to find their targets. That would alert the enemy. They used passive thermal sensors, sniffing for the heat of the enemy engines against the cold background of the ice. On the Russian ships, the close-in weapon systems, the Kishtans and AK-630s, had independent power supplies. Their automated turrets spun up, their radar dishes searching frantically. They spotted the incoming vampires at the last second. The night air was torn apart by the buzzsaw roar of Gatling guns. Tracers lit up the Arctic night like a chaotic rave, streams of red lead pouring into the darkness. But the LRASMs were too smart. They performed random high-G maneuvers, jinking left, diving right. One missile was hit, exploding in a fireball above the waves, then another. But 46 got through. 4:50 a.m. Impact. The first missile didn't hit the Nanchang's hull. It hit the bridge. The warhead was a shaped charge, designed to punch through armor before detonating. It vaporized the command center. Seconds later, 3 more missiles struck the Pyotr Veliky. They slammed into the port side, just below the waterline and just above the magazine. The explosions were foundational. The ship, weighing 28,000 tons, shuddered violently, lifting out of the water. The heat from the impact ignited the fuel of the Zircon missiles stored on deck. This was the catastrophic kill. A secondary explosion, a white-hot bloom of chemical fire, tore the battlecruiser in half. The shockwave flattened the waves for a mile in every direction. The pride of the Russian Navy was a burning wreck in seconds, but the surface battle was just the distraction. The real threat, the civilization-ending threat, was below. The Boré-class submarines. You can sink a fleet, but if one nuclear sub survives, it can still burn every city in America. The U.S. Navy knew this. The Jimmy Carter had saved its special weapon for them. 4:55 a.m. The USS Jimmy Carter opened outer doors 3 and 4. They didn't fire wire-guided torpedoes. Those are too slow. They fired the Manta supercavitating torpedo. This weapon creates a bubble of gas around itself, eliminating water friction. It travels at 230 miles per hour underwater. It is a bullet. The Russian subs were already in chaos. The initial EMP blast from the orcas had scrambled their passive sonar. They were deaf. They never heard the mantas. The acoustic data from the SOSUS arrays recorded 4 distinct, sickening sounds. Not explosions. Implosions. Crump. 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 The mantas impacted the titanium hulls of the Boré submarines. At that depth, and with the hull integrity breached, the ocean did the rest. The pressure of the deep Atlantic rushed in with the force of a freight train. The submarines crumpled like soda cans. By 4:58 a.m., 41 minutes after the fleet was first detected, the battle was effectively over. The radar scopes at Northwood were clearing. The massive, angry red blotches were gone. In their place were the fading thermal blooms of burning oil and the chaotic noise of breaking metal settling onto the seabed. There was no negotiation. There was no surrender. The rules of engagement for a threat this high, this close to the homeland, were absolute. The entire fleet, billions of dollars of hardware, thousands of sailors, and enough nuclear ordnance to end the world, had been neutralized. The sun would not rise over the Denmark Strait for another 4 hours. The darkness remained, but the silence did not return. The ocean was churning. The surviving support ships, the oilers, the tugs, the intelligence trawlers were scattering. They were turning hard about, engines redlining, fleeing back to the safety of the Barents Sea. They were not targeted. The U.S. Navy let them go. They needed witnesses. They needed someone to go back to Murmansk and tell the story of what happens when you cross the line. At 5:15 a.m., the red phone between Washington and Moscow rang. It rang in the Oval Office. The president picked it up. The line crackled with encryption protocols. On the other end was silence, then the heavy breathing of a man who has just lost his queen in a chess game. The conversation was brief. There were no threats issued by the Russian president. There was no bluster about retaliation. There was only a stunned, icy shock. The Chinese leadership in Beijing went into an immediate, unprecedented information lockdown. Internet cables were throttled. Social media was scrubbed. By 6 a.m., the spin began. The official state media in Russia and China released a synchronized statement. They reported a tragic accident during a joint training exercise in the northern seas. They claimed a freak weather anomaly, a rogue wave combined with an internal munitions malfunction, had caused catastrophic damage. They denied any hostile intent. They denied they were near Greenland. They frantically tried to cover up the fact that their most powerful naval assets had just been erased from the board in under an hour. The West played along. This is the delicate dance of nuclear powers. You don't humiliate your enemy in public. You defeat them in private. Publicly, NATO issued a statement expressing condolences for the accident at sea and offered search and rescue assistance. Privately, the U.S. Navy had already deployed salvage drones to the wreckage site. They weren't looking for survivors. They were looking for tech. They were scanning the debris of the Type 055 destroyers to learn the frequencies of their radar. They were collecting samples of the Russian zircon fuel residue. The global financial markets wobbled as rumors of the clash leaked out, whispers of a naval skirmish. But because the destruction was so total and so fast, the market barely had time to panic. There was no drawn-out war. It was a surgical removal of a tumor. However, the geopolitical reality had shifted permanently. The 4:17 a.m. incident proved 2 terrifying things. First, that the alliance between Russia and China was bold enough to attempt a checkmate move against the West. They were willing to risk it all on a surprise attack. And second, that the United States' military technological edge, specifically in undersea warfare and stealth integration, was still absolute. The Orca drones and the B-21 Raiders had performed flawlessly. But military analysts, the old men in the smoky rooms of the Pentagon, know that this is only the beginning. The Dragon Bear Alliance will learn from this. They will study the 41 minutes of their defeat. They will analyze the debris. They will realize that surface ships are coffins in the age of hypersonic missiles. Next time, they won't use ships. Next time, the threat will be entirely unmanned. Or it will be orbital. Or it will be a cyber attack that turns off the power grid before a single shot is fired. The 4:17 a.m. deployment was a test. The 41-minute destruction was the answer. But the question remains, what happens when they try again? The ocean near Greenland is quiet again. The wrecks of the Pyotr Veliki and the Nanchang are settling on the bottom, 2 miles down, joining the ghosts of the Bismarck and the Hood. The crabs will pick them clean. The salt will eat the steel. But the watch continues. In the dark room in Northwood, David Thorne is still staring at his screen. The green waterfall of noise flows on. He knows that somewhere, in a shipyard in Shanghai or a dry dock in Severodvinsk, the keel of a new ship is being laid. A faster ship, a quieter ship. This was a victory, yes, but in the game of global dominance, there are no final victories, only delays, and the clock is always ticking.